April 3rd, 1943. In the small Bavarian town of Heidelbach, snow fell gently on cobblestone streets as Margaret Fischer stood alone at the town well, her once friendly neighbors now crossing to the opposite side when they saw her approach. The weight of isolation had become as familiar to her as the bucket she carried each morning. She believed this would be her life forever now, the girl who had loved unwisely and paid with her place in society. But 600 miles away, a transport plane was preparing to depart from an airfield in England, carrying a man whose return would upend everything her community thought they knew about loyalty and power. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how one woman's forbidden love would become an unexpected mirror, reflecting back to an entire town the true nature of courage, and how the uniform most feared in wartime Germany would become a symbol not of vengeance, but of something far more powerful. In 1940, Heidelbach had been like hundreds of other German towns, deeply patriotic, economically revitalized after years of hardship, and increasingly hostile to those deemed outsiders. The Fischer family had lived in Heidelbach for 4 generations. Karl Fischer, Margarete's father, owned the town's most successful bakery, supplying bread to nearly every household and employing 6 local men. Her mother, Elsa, was known for her volunteer work with the local Women's Association, and their home on Lindenstrasse was often filled with town officials and respected business owners. At 23, Margaret had been considered one of the town's most eligible young women, educated, well-mannered, and blessed with striking features that drew attention wherever she went. Her golden hair fell in natural waves to her shoulders, and her clear blue eyes seemed to reflect both intelligence and warmth. She had received numerous offers of courtship from local men, including the son of the town's mayor and a young officer recently promoted within the regional administration. But Margaret's heart had already been claimed. 3 years earlier, while studying literature at a university in Munich, she had met Daniel Abramovich, a brilliant mathematics student with gentle brown eyes and a quiet confidence that immediately drew her to him. Daniel's family had lived in Germany for generations, respected academics who had contributed significantly to the country's scientific advancement. When Margaret brought Daniel home to meet her parents in the summer of 1938, they had welcomed him warmly, impressed by his education and thoughtful demeanor. "Your young man has a remarkable mind," Karl had told his daughter after an evening of lengthy discussions about German literature and philosophy. A bit serious, perhaps, but that will serve him well in his career. Elsa had been equally approving, noting how attentively Daniel listened to everyone at the table, including their youngest son Hans, who was only 12 at the time. "He shows respect," she observed. "That speaks well of his character and his upbringing." But that was before the new laws had been fully implemented, before neighbors began reporting on neighbors, before Daniel's family name appeared on a list that changed everything. By 1940, the Fischer family had been forced to make a choice that many German families faced, between their personal connections and their public standing. When it became known that Margaret was continuing to exchange letters with Daniel after his family had been forced to close their bookshop in Munich, the first warning came from an unexpected source. Mayor Werner Kleinschmidt, whose son had long admired Margaret, visited the bakery one afternoon when it was empty of customers. "Karl, we have known each other since we were boys," the mayor said, his voice lowered despite the empty shop. "So I speak to you now as a friend, not as the mayor. There are questions being asked about your daughter's associations, questions that could impact your business, your family's standing." Karl Fischer had always considered himself a principled man. "Werner, Daniel Abramovich is a good man from a respectable family. They have been in Germany longer than some of our own families." The mayor shook his head. "It doesn't matter anymore, Karl. Those distinctions are gone. There are only Germans and non-Germans now. For your family's sake, for your business, for the 20 people who depend on your bakery for their daily bread, you must make Margaret understand this." That night, Karl and Elsa had spoken to their daughter, voices strained with the impossible position they found themselves in. They did not demand, they pleaded. "Times have changed, Margareta," her father said. It is not about what is in our hearts anymore. It is about survival. Margaret had stood by the window, her back to her parents. Would you have me betray the man I love because it has become convenient to do so? What does that make us, if we abandon people when they need us most? Her mother had begun to cry silently. You speak as though this is simple, as though it is only about love. There are your brothers to consider, your father's employees. The Schroeders down the street had their windows broken last week because their daughter was seen walking with someone questioned by the authorities. And you think this will pass? Margaret had turned, her eyes bright with conviction. That if we all stay silent and obedient, things will eventually return to normal. This will only end when enough people refuse to participate. In the end, no agreement was reached. Margaret continued to write to Daniel, who had fled with his parents to Switzerland. His letters described his family's struggle to establish themselves in a new country, his father's declining health due to the stress of their displacement, and his own efforts to continue his studies despite the disruption. Never once did he blame Germany or express bitterness toward the country of his birth. Instead, his letters were filled with hope that reason would eventually prevail. The consequences for Margaret and her family mounted gradually. First came the social isolation. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended when she entered shops. Former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting her. Then economic pressure followed. Orders at the bakery decreased. Carl Fischer, who had always donated leftover bread to the local orphanage, was informed that his donations were no longer needed. By 1941, the family business was struggling. 2 employees had been let go, and there were rumors that the regional administration was considering revoking their flour ration due to distribution concerns. It was Hans, now 15, who suffered the most visible effects. Excluded from youth activities and taunted at school, he returned home one day with a bloodied nose after defending his sister's name. That night, the family council that followed was tense with unspoken accusations. I cannot watch this family be destroyed, Carl finally said, his voice heavy with defeat. Margaret, I have never asked you to abandon your principles, but I am asking you now to consider the cost, not just to yourself but to all of us. Margaret looked at her younger brother's injured face, at her mother's hands, now raw from taking in washing to supplement the family income, at her father's shoulders, stooped with worry. Something broke within her. The next day she wrote one final letter to Daniel, explaining that she could no longer correspond. She didn't share the pressure her family was facing, knowing it would only add to his burdens. Instead, she wrote of changing feelings, of realizing they had been too young to know their own minds. It was the only lie she had ever told him, and writing those words felt like carving pieces from her own heart. Daniel's reply came 3 weeks later, a brief note accepting her decision with dignity, wishing her happiness, and expressing gratitude for the time they had shared. Margaret burned the letter after reading it, then walked to the town hall where she requested an audience with Mayor Kleinschmidt. The system required public demonstrations of loyalty. In full view of town officials, Margaret handed over all of Daniel's previous letters and formally renounced her misguided association. She was then assigned to volunteer with the local women's organization, sewing garments to be sent to German soldiers at the front. But the damage had been done. Though the bakery was allowed to continue operating and the most overt harassment stopped, Margaret remained marked in the town's memory. She had shown independent thinking, had questioned the new order, and such transgressions were not easily forgotten. When other young women her age were marrying and establishing homes, Margaret remained alone, living with her parents and working in the bakery, her former academic ambitions abandoned. In private moments, she wondered about Daniel, whether he had found safety, whether he had continued his studies, whether he had met someone else. But such thoughts she kept locked away, focusing instead on helping her family rebuild their business and standing. By 1943, things had begun to change in Heidelberg and across Germany. The confident predictions of quick victory had given way to more somber assessments. Supply shortages became common. More and more homes displayed photographs of sons and fathers in uniform, some with black ribbons indicating they would never return. The town's mood shifted from triumphant patriotism to grim endurance. It was during this period of growing uncertainty that Margaret experienced her own personal earthquake. A letter arrived from Switzerland, not from Daniel but from his mother, Rebecca Abramovich. The letter, written in careful, formal German, informed Margaret that Daniel had made his way to England in 1942. Unable to bear remaining safe while others fought against what was happening in his homeland, he had volunteered with the Allied forces. 3 months ago, she wrote, they had received word that Daniel had been captured during an operation in North Africa. I write to you now, Rebecca's letter concluded, because despite everything, Daniel spoke of you with great affection until the very end. I wanted you to know that he understood the impossible position you were in and never blamed you for the choice you were forced to make. The letter was signed with a simple, "May God keep you safe in these difficult times." Margaret read the letter 7 times, then hid it beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. That night, she prayed for the first time since childhood, not with the formal prayers approved by the state, but with the desperate, honest words of someone confronting the possibility of permanent loss. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The war that had once seemed distant now cast its shadow over everything. Heidelberg was largely spared the devastation visited upon larger cities, but everyone knew someone who had been lost. Everyone felt the squeeze of rationing and the growing fear of what would happen if Germany did not prevail. By early 1945, the reality of Germany's situation could no longer be denied. Foreign troops were advancing from both east and west. Many of those who had been most vocal in their support of the regime now spoke in whispers about having always had private reservations. Mayor Kleinschmidt was rarely seen in public, sending his assistants to deliver increasingly dire announcements about conservation measures and civil defense preparations. In the Fischer household, conversations focused on practical matters: how to stretch their increasingly limited supplies, how to keep the bakery functioning despite flour shortages, how to protect themselves if fighting reached their town. They avoided discussing the larger questions of how Germany had arrived at this point and what would come after. April 7th, 1945. Margarete was working alone in the bakery, using the last of their flour to prepare bread for the following day, when she heard vehicles entering the town square. Military transports had become a common sight, usually German units in retreat, sometimes stopping to requisition supplies before moving on. She continued her work, not bothering to look up until the bell above the door jingled. A man in an American uniform stood in the doorway. For a moment, Margaret froze, her hands covered in flour, her mind racing through the German phrases she had been told to use if their town was occupied. "We are civilians. We have no weapons. We will cooperate." But before she could speak, the soldier removed his helmet, and 5 years of carefully maintained composure shattered. Standing before her, thinner and with a new scar along his jawline but unmistakably himself, was Daniel Abramovich. "Hello, Margarete," he said in German. "It's been a long time." The rolling pin she had been holding clattered to the floor. "Daniel, but your mother's letter. She said you were..." "Captured, yes, but not killed. I was in a prisoner camp for 14 months before being liberated by advancing Allied forces. After recovery, I volunteered as an interpreter for the American units." He stepped further into the shop, closing the door behind him. Up close, Margaret could see the changes in him, not just the physical ones, but a new watchfulness in his eyes, a contained energy that hadn't been there before. "Why are you here?" she managed to ask. "In Heidelberg, I mean. I requested this assignment. Our unit is tasked with establishing order in towns as they're secured, identifying those who were active in supporting the regime and protecting civilians." He paused, then added more softly, "And I wanted to make sure your family was safe." The simple kindness of that statement, after everything that had happened after her betrayal, broke something in Margaret. Tears she had held back for years finally spilled over. "My family is safe," she said. "Though much has changed. Father's health has declined. Hans was conscripted last year. We've had no word for 3 months." Daniel nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that in wartime silence often carried the heaviest meanings. "I have some connections now. I can make inquiries about Hans." Before Margaret could respond, the door opened again and 3 more American soldiers entered. One with captain's insignia, addressed Daniel rapidly in English. Margaret caught only a few words, something about the town hall and documents. Daniel responded, then turned back to Margaret. "I have to go, but I'll return later, if that's all right. There's much we should discuss." She nodded, suddenly aware of her flower-covered apron, her hair hastily pinned up, the stark contrast between her worn appearance and his crisp uniform. Yes, of course. As Daniel and the other soldiers left, Margaret became aware of faces watching from across the square. Neighbors who had seen American soldiers entering the Fisher bakery, who had recognized Daniel despite the years and the uniform. By evening, the news would be all over town. That night, Daniel returned as promised, accompanied by another American soldier who remained outside the bakery, standing guard. The Fisher family received him in their living quarters above the shop, a space that had once welcomed him warmly and now felt charged with unspoken history. Carl Fisher, now using a cane and looking much older than his years, shook Daniel's hand with genuine emotion. "Life takes unexpected turns. The last time you sat at our table, I could never have imagined the circumstances that would bring you back to us." Elsa embraced Daniel, tears in her eyes. "I have prayed for your safety and for your forgiveness." Daniel's composure, maintained throughout the war and his return, finally softened. "There is nothing to forgive. You were protecting your family as anyone would." The conversation that followed was unlike any the Fisher home had hosted during the war years. For the first time, they spoke openly about everything. The gradual changes in Heidelbach as the ideology took hold, the impossible choices families had faced, the information that had been controlled and manipulated. Daniel shared his own journey, fleeing to Switzerland, making his way to England, his decision to volunteer despite his parents' concerns. "I couldn't stand by and watch the country I loved destroy itself and others," he explained, "but I also never wanted revenge. That's why I requested to serve as an interpreter rather than in combat. I wanted to help rebuild, not destroy." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself studying Daniel when he wasn't looking directly at her, noting how his hands, once ink-stained from mathematical calculations, now moved with a new precision, how he expressed himself with a quiet authority that commanded attention. This was not the idealistic student she had known, but a man who had seen the worst humanity could offer and somehow maintained his compassion. Later, when her parents retired for the evening, Margaret and Daniel sat alone by the window overlooking the darkened town square. "Your mother wrote to me," Margaret said, "when they thought you had been killed. That's how I learned you had joined the Allied forces." Daniel nodded. "She told me after we were reunited. She said she felt you deserved to know." He hesitated before continuing. "She also told me about your final letter, that you ended things between us." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I wrote things I didn't mean. My family was suffering because of my refusal to distance myself from you. The bakery was being targeted. Hans was being beaten at school. I couldn't watch them bear the cost of my principles." "I understood," Daniel said simply. "Even then, I understood." They sat in silence for a moment, 5 years of separation and world-changing events hanging in the air between them. "What happens now?" Margaret finally asked. "To the town? To Germany?" "Reconstruction, denazification. It will be a long process with difficult reckonings." His voice was neither triumphant nor condemning, merely factual. "Some who were most complicit are already fleeing. Others are destroying evidence of their involvement. But there will be accountability, especially for those in positions of authority." "And the ordinary people? Those who didn't actively participate, but didn't resist either?" Daniel considered this. That's the more complex question, isn't it? The line between complicity and survival wasn't always clear. He looked at her directly. "I don't think most Americans or British understand how gradually it all happened, how insidious the changes were, how difficult resistance became once the system was fully in place." "Some did resist," Margaret said quietly. "Not enough of us, but some." The following morning brought a scene Heidelbach's residents would remember for decades to come. American military vehicles were parked in the town square as soldiers established their temporary headquarters in the town hall. Among them, instantly recognizable despite his foreign uniform, was Daniel Abramovich, the young man many remembered from before the war, the one whose relationship with Margarete Fischer had once scandalized the town. Mayor Kleinschmidt, attempting to maintain some dignity in defeat, had assembled the town council to formally surrender administrative control. He had spent the previous night burning documents, but many records remained, including those detailing which citizens had been most enthusiastic in their support of the regime, who had reported their neighbors, who had benefited from properties and businesses redistributed from those deemed undesirable. As Kleinschmidt prepared to address the American captain through an interpreter, he was startled to see Daniel step forward instead. Even more disconcerting was Daniel's perfect German, as he began translating the American officer's terms. No resistance, full cooperation, immediate surrender of any weapons, preservation of all town records. Throughout the square, whispers spread as townspeople recognized the interpreter. For years, many had parroted the belief that people like Daniel were somehow lesser, somehow un-German despite generations of contribution to the country's culture and advancement. Now he stood before them in the uniform of the victorious Allied forces, his education and language skills making him an essential bridge between the occupiers and the occupied. The irony was lost on no one, least of all those who had been most vocal in ostracizing Margarete and pressuring her family. Several of those who had once crossed the street to avoid speaking with her now found reasons to approach the Fischer bakery, making small talk about the weather or offering belated sympathy about Hans's conscription. Margarete received these overtures with outward politeness and inward skepticism. How quickly principles change when circumstances do, she observed to her mother after a particularly transparent visit from the wife of a town official. Over the following weeks, Daniel's presence in Heidelbach created ripples that extended far beyond his official duties. Each morning, he would stop at the Fischer bakery for coffee before beginning his workday. This simple act, a Jewish man in an American uniform being welcomed in a German establishment, became a powerful symbol in a community struggling to reorient itself after years of ideology-driven isolation. Daniel's role gave him access to information about German soldiers being processed through Allied camps. True to his promise, he made inquiries about Hans Fischer. 2 weeks after his arrival, he brought news that Hans had been identified in a British-controlled camp near Hamburg. Though thin and exhausted, the young man was uninjured and would likely be among the first civilians released to return home. The Fischers' joy was complicated by the knowledge that many other families were receiving different news, confirmations of deaths or uncertainty that would stretch on for years. Their good fortune highlighted the arbitrary nature of war's outcomes, the way lives were shattered or spared by circumstances beyond individual control. As the initial shock of occupation settled into a new routine, Daniel found himself in an unexpected position. To the Americans, he was a valuable asset, fluent in German, familiar with local customs, able to discern which townspeople were being truthful about their wartime activities and which were attempting to rewrite their personal histories. To the people of Heidelbach, he represented both a living reminder of their collective moral failure and a potential advocate with the occupying forces. This dual role placed Daniel at the center of the town's painful transition. When the American authorities began formal investigations into those who had held positions of power during the war, Daniel was often present for the interviews, translating questions and responses. He heard former officials claim they had only followed orders, heard neighbors deny their participation in the ostracization of families like the Fischers, heard former friends describe their secret resistance that had never been visible during the years when it mattered most. Through it all, Daniel maintained a professionalism that impressed both his American superiors and the German civilians. He neither sought revenge against those who had supported his exclusion, nor did he allow the most complicit to escape accountability through selective translation or convenient omissions. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session interviewing a former police official who had enthusiastically enforced anti-Jewish regulations, Captain Miller, Daniel's American superior, expressed his bewilderment. "I don't understand how you can sit across from these people without anger," Miller said as they walked back to their temporary quarters. "If someone had driven my family from our home, threatened our lives, I'm not sure I could be so." Measured, Daniel considered this as they passed buildings still displaying the scars of ideological conformity. Anger doesn't rebuild anything, he finally said, and most of these people were neither monsters nor heroes, just ordinary humans who failed a moral test most of us hope we never face. His work brought him into regular contact with Margaret, who had been asked by the American authorities to help coordinate food distribution in the town. Their professional interactions were watched with intense interest by the townspeople, many of whom now viewed their former relationship through an entirely different lens. Where once they had whispered about the impropriety of a German girl associating with a Jewish man, they now speculated about whether the American interpreter might use his influence to punish those who had treated him and the Fisher family poorly. The fact that no such retribution materialized confused many who had been conditioned to expect power to be wielded vengefully. One evening in late May, Daniel and Margaret walked together along the river that ran through Heidelbach. Spring had arrived despite the war's devastation, and wildflowers bloomed along the banks. "The Americans are establishing a civilian affairs office next month," Daniel said. "They've asked me to stay on as a permanent liaison. The assignment would keep me in Heidelbach for at least a year." Margaret processed this information carefully. "And you're considering it?" "I am," he acknowledged, "though not for the reasons most people in town probably assume." She looked at him questioningly. "Half the town thinks I've stayed to exact some kind of revenge," Daniel explained with a wry smile. "To enjoy watching them squirm under American authority. The other half thinks I'm here to protect them from the worst consequences of occupation." "And the truth?" Margaret asked. Daniel stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "The truth is both simpler and more complicated. I'm here because this is where healing needs to happen, not just for Germany, but for me." He gestured toward the town across the river. "Every street there holds memories of what we lost. Not just you and me, but all of us. The world we thought we were building before everything changed." Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Sometimes I think about the life we might have had. The plans we made at university before." "I do too," Daniel admitted, "but I've also come to believe that who we've become through this, who you've become, who I've become, may be serving a greater purpose than the life we originally imagined." As they resumed walking, Margaret gathered her courage to ask the question that had lingered since his return. "Is there someone waiting for you?" "In England or America?" Daniel shook his head. "No, there were opportunities, but—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear enough. The summer of 1945 brought both healing and painful reckonings to Heidelbach. Hans Fischer returned home, physically recovered but carrying invisible scars from his brief but intense experience of combat. Mayor Kleinschmidt was removed from office and placed under house arrest pending investigation of his wartime activities. Several town officials were taken to regional centers for more formal questioning. For most of the town's residents, daily life became a process of adaptation to foreign occupation, to the absence of those who would never return, to the gradual revelation of truths that had been hidden during the war years. As food supplies stabilized and basic services were restored, people began the process of psychological rehabilitation, reconciling their wartime beliefs and actions with the new reality. The Fisher Bakery became an unexpected center of community rebuilding. With American support, Carl Fisher received priority for flour rations, allowing the bakery to produce bread for the entire town. The shop that had once been avoided by many now saw daily queues forming before dawn. More significantly, it became a neutral space where townspeople could interact with the American authorities through Daniel and Margaret, voicing concerns and asking questions without fear. As summer turned to autumn, Daniel's role evolved from military interpreter to civilian administrator, helping to establish new democratic institutions in Heidelbach. The uniform that had once symbolized defeat to the town now represented something more complex, the possibility of reconstruction rather than punishment, of a future built on different principles than the past. For Margaret and Daniel, the months of working together created a new foundation for their relationship, one based not on youthful idealism, but on shared purpose and mutual respect for who they had become through adversity. They moved cautiously, aware of the many eyes watching them, and the complicated symbolism their relationship held for the town. By December 1945, when Daniel formally proposed, their engagement represented more than a personal union. For many in Heidelberg, it signified a form of redemption, proof that bridges could be rebuilt across the chasms the war had created. The announcement was met with genuine congratulations from some, polite acknowledgement from others, and telling silence from a few who still clung to the ideology that had led Germany to ruin. Their wedding in the spring of 1946 was attended by a mixture of American military personnel, townspeople, and Daniel's parents, who had been able to return to Switzerland from their wartime refuge in England. Rebecca Abramovich, seeing her son stand beside the woman who had once been forbidden to him, whispered to her husband, "Perhaps this is how healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with individual acts of reconciliation." In the years that followed, Daniel and Margaret became central figures in Heidelberg's transition to democratic governance. When the American occupation ended, they chose to remain in the town rather than emigrate to America as many had expected. Their decision to stay and help rebuild the Germany they still loved, despite everything, challenged the community to confront its collective past, honestly, rather than through convenient forgetting. The bakery expanded into a small cafe where townspeople gathered to discuss the news, debate politics openly for the first time in years, and gradually reclaim their voices as citizens rather than subjects. Karl Fischer lived to see his grandson born in 1948, a child who would grow up in a Germany striving to build safeguards against the failures of its past. Margaret, who had once been ostracized for loving across boundaries others sought to enforce, became a respected teacher in the town's reconstructed school, emphasizing critical thinking and moral courage in her lessons. Daniel, drawing on both his mathematical training and his wartime experiences, helped establish a regional technical college focused on rebuilding Germany's peacetime industries. Together, they embodied a truth that Heidelberg and countless other communities across Europe were slowly, painfully learning. That human connection could transcend the artificial divisions of ideology, that courage often resided in ordinary choices rather than dramatic actions, and that the uniform most feared had ultimately brought not destruction, but the opportunity for renewal. As decades passed, and Germany rebuilt itself into a democratic nation, committed to preventing the recurrence of its darkest chapter, the story of Margaret and Daniel became part of Heidelberg's unofficial history, not as a fairy tale of good triumphing over evil, but as a complex human narrative about failure, resilience, and the difficult work of reconciliation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.